So I'm going to start with a disclaimer, and that disclaimer is, I know it's not August, but the jet lag really is that real. So I'm going to look at war, pestilence, death, and statistics. Now, is this a grouping that makes sense? Well, if you had to study any statistics at maybe college level or degree level, this might kind of resonate with your views of it. A lot of people have a deep-seated feeling of dread when it comes to any kind of maths or statistics, which is why a big part of my career is outreach to break that down. But am I actually a statistician? Okay, yeah, I suppose I am. In my day-to-day research, I'm interested in applying statistics, data science, AI, if you like, machine learning, all those different kind of things to solve problems in virus evolution and epidemiology. Because I've got a short attention span, that covers really everything from the genetics of SARS-CoV-2 through to the ecology behind how bird flu spreads, the evolutionary theory of why viruses actually cause disease in different tissues, and even studying how we as scientists changed our practice of published research during the pandemic. But even then, as a statistician, the key for me has always been about health and biology. And a lot of people that I speak to think that statistics is really just all about maths and equations. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So I always compare statistics to reading a storybook. So it's about understanding the story that some data can tell you. Now, the maths and the equations are a little bit like the physical paper and the ink. I mean, obviously, they're important because without them, we wouldn't have a book. But most people, when you sit down and read a book, you're not actually looking at ink and looking at paper. You're trying to translate the information in that story into something new. And for me, it's something that I can learn about the world from that data. So in 2016, I applied to be a statistical ambassador for the Royal Statistical Society of the UK. This is a scheme that the RSS decided to develop to try and train a set of stats from all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of sectors, to basically build a diverse team with the aim of improving public communication of stats. And there's about 30 of us total now. I think we've got about 10 more coming in the next year. That's me down there. I was part of the second cohort. And I sort of think of us as a team of statistical superheroes. So we take up voluntary jobs that come into the RSS. So if somebody's lighting that big stats help beacon, one of us will then receive that job and come and help out. So it could be that somebody wants a speaker for a public venue like this, or maybe somebody's a journalist and they want to run a story, but they're not really sure what the evidence can and can't say. This is when one of us will step in. Just like Superhero Squad, we've got all kinds of different skill sets because we all come from such different backgrounds. So I suppose then I've taken up the challenging task of trying to help the public understand stats for about 8 years now. That's led to working with media institutions like BBC's Panorama, the Guardian newspaper, to find what we can reliably say about some stories around health, demography. More often than not, it actually leads to nothing being produced because it turns out that there wasn't actually enough evidence for the potential story to be run. But of course, I had to get involved with the BBC again the other year when the UK hosted Eurovision, and BBC Bitesize wanted to know what is the statistical formula to win. And unfortunately, the BBC production team did not listen to me a single bit, so we ended up bottom of the table. But I've also taught stats to the public through a lot of kind of science festivals, local societies and such like. I've done the Edinburgh Fringe Festival back in the UK a few times. This is my poster for the very first time I was at the Fringe in 2017. It does seem a little bit difficult to look back on this now. I don't think I'm going to be doing this talk in any format again anytime soon. But my goal in all of this outreach has basically been, can I get a public audience to think more critically about the frankly huge volume of data and numbers and figures that we're all now bombarded with on a daily basis? So what I'm going to do tonight is really recap some classic statistical fallacies through some of the more kind of, I suppose, morbid or grim tales of human history. Now, as an audience of skeptics, I imagine you are probably already really pretty good on your critical thinking, so I'm really just going to show how I try and bring these to life for general public audiences. Now, why have I chosen to blend the mathematical field of statistics with the biblical figures of the four horsemen of the apocalypse? Is it really just me trying to be cool and edgy? And yeah, it is. But it's also because a lot of the statistics we use on a daily basis do have their ultimate roots in, I suppose, traditionally sinful or devilish practices. I mean, the most obvious one is gambling, right? So this is where probability really kicked off over some dice betting games. And this here on the top right, this is, top left, is Antoine Gambeau. So he was a French nobleman in the 1650s, and he did what pretty much all French noblemen dressed like this did, and he just sat around and drank and gambled with most of his time. And what he noticed was that when he played two games with his friends, the first game was to try and get a single 6 in 4 rolls of a die, and the second game was to try and get a double 6 in 24 rolls of 2 dice. Now what he noticed was that he would tend to win at this first game, but he'd tend to lose at this second game, even though to him, they appeared like they should be superficially very, very similar. And so to find out what was going on, he wrote to 2 mathematicians, so he wrote to Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat, and they solved this by developing this idea of what we now know to be probability. They developed probability for the very first time. Except that's not actually true. Because we now know that Girolamo Cardano in Italy developed probability about 100 years earlier. It's just that he never published it. So this is just what published records tell you. So Girolamo Cardano developed probability for the very first time. Except that's not true either. Because that's what Western scholarship will tell you. But it was arguably formulated much, much earlier by Mahavira, who was a 9th century Indian mathematician, and he applied combinatorics to gambling problems. Now, really, whichever one of these is or isn't true, the point remains that we would not have probability if we hadn't thrown ourselves into such sinful vices as gambling. And if it's not gambling, it's booze. I mean, statisticians do owe a lot to alcohol, maybe not in the way that you're thinking. So imagine the turn of the 20th century. Guinness is now becoming hugely, hugely popular. The production has tripled. This is the Dublin factory here, and they just cannot keep up with the demand. And if you know anything about beer, and I make no apologies, I'm a total beer, but if you know anything about beer, then you'll know that you can use hops to make beer. That's kind of the plant used to flavour the beer. And you might also know that you can roughly tell how good the quality of hops are by how they look, how they feel, how they smell. It's not the best measure in the world. So if you're going by those metrics, you've basically got to check your whole batch of hops to see if they're any good. Now, I haven't got hops, but what I do have is Guinness. And it's the equivalent of me only being able to compare the tastes of these 2 pints of Guinness if I drank the entire things in one go. And I can tell you that if I do that, you're not going to have the rest of this talk. So as a bit of a solution to this, an apprentice brewer at the time named William Seeley Gossett, he started thinking about this. And he came up with a statistical approximation that lets you reliably compare 2 batches in their quality. But the really clever bit that he came up with is that you don't need to check the whole thing. You only need to take a very, very small sample. So I'm going to sample these now. There is no statistical difference between those 2 things.
What test do you require?
Yeah, let's do a replication. So William Seeley Gossett's method, I mean, at that time it could seriously revolutionise how we do stats. But the problem was Guinness didn't want him to tell anybody about it. Because if Guinness's competitors found out, they could start using the same method for themselves. And so to keep it a tightly guarded secret, he published it under this pseudonym, the secret identity student. And this is from where we derive student's t-distribution, or you might have heard of a t-test. nobody actually found out who this kind of illustrious student was until after Seeley Gossett's death in the 1930s. And this is still a super important backbone of a lot of quantitative sciences now, from astronomy to zoology. And small samples, wherever we compare them, this is the preferable method. So yeah, it's entirely possible the contents of your glass right now have been perfected thanks to William Seeley Gossett. And if you ever do go to all the way to Ireland, to Dublin, and visit the Guinness factory, definitely encourage you to seek out this plaque. Not a lot of people know this is there. There's this memorial to William Seeley Gossett, chemist and statistician who developed students' t-test. Don't forget to raise a glass to a student when you go. Now, as much as I could talk about alcohol, really, I'm meant to be talking about horsemen. So let's start with war. And specifically, the war we're going to look at is World War II, and a man named Abraham Wald. And Wald was a Hungarian statistician who studied and worked in Vienna in the early 1930s. And when the events leading up to the Second World War began and the Nazi Party began to control more and more of Europe, Wald took his family and moved to the United States. And when the war began, Wald's intelligence and his amazing mathematical capabilities were very quickly sought out by the US government to help them solve some wartime problems. Now, he's actually part of the SRG, the Statistical Research Group. Now, that does not sound very exciting, but honestly, if we as stats ambassadors are a superhero squad, this is like the OG Avengers. This is some of the most amazing statistical powerhouses and fantastic minds that the world even had to offer at the time. They were all in one place. Now, one of the problems that the US military asked Abraham Wald to look at was how to protect the lives of their fighter plane pilots. And I know many of you might know this story already, but this is how I basically tell this story at science festivals. So you might have noticed some coloured paper on your table, and it looks a little bit like this. Looks like this. So I would like somebody who knows how to make paper planes, or really anybody who wants to try it, to fold along these lines, because this is actually a template for a paper plane. Now, it doesn't really matter if you mess it up slightly. It doesn't really matter if you don't stick to the lines. All we're looking for is a vague shape of a plane. And what I'm also going to ask you to do is, if the person folding that piece of paper could write their initials on it, you should have a pen as well that I put on every table. I would like you to put your initials very clearly on the plane somewhere. If you're thinking, this sounds like the start of an amazing magic trick, you are going to be so disappointed. But while you are folding those, I'm going to look for the one that I have. Here we go. So here's the one that I have proverbially prepared earlier. So you notice maybe there's different colours on these planes. So the different colours of the different sections of the plane. You've got the wings in green. The which bit is the blue? It's the engine in blue. And then you've got the kind of purpley bit is the body of the plane, or the fuselage. And then the red at the back is the fuel storage. And what the US military wanted to know is, where should they put the armour on their fighter planes? And your first thought might be, well, put the armour everywhere. And okay, it's a pretty good idea. The only problem is, that makes the planes too heavy to fly. So we have to be really selective about the parts of the plane that we're going to put armour on. You know, the wings, the body, and so on. And the way that the US military decided to make that decision is that they wanted to review the planes that had returned from battle in Europe. So I'm going to check how we're looking with the paper planes. They're looking pretty good, actually. Yeah, nice. Nice. How are we going on that side of the room? Still going. Make sure you've written your initials on, like I say. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to fly your planes into battle. So I'm going to ask you to fly them over to me, send them over to Europe, very gently, because we have not done a risk assessment. And then your planes are going to go to battle. So, are we just about ready? Even if they're not kind of quite right. Yeah, we've got one here, one right there. one's still going there. I'm going to check over here.
You got the jump ring?
Oh, I have. Trust me, I have.
We don't.
That looks good to fly, yeah. Yeah, that looks good to fly back. So I'm going to ask you, right, okay. Doesn't matter, it's not finished. I'm going to ask you to hold it up. And then on 3, 3, 2, 1, fly your planes toward me. Ooh, those were good, genuinely. Genuinely, at least one normally goes to Antarctica instead of Europe, but they were all kind of the right direction. Right, was there another one over there that I missed? Yeah, it's just down there.
This one made it 1 page.
Perfect, thank you.
Can we do 2 hops?
Yeah, go on.
It's a stunt, like, we don't long distance.
There's always one that needs to go back to the maintenance shed. Right. Not you, by the way, I'm playing. So, what I'm about to do now is I'm about to simulate the battle. And you're going to find that your planes are going to come back with some damage. They're going to be shot at during the battle. So while I do that, we're just going to get in the mood. Hopefully this isn't going to be too loud. Right, that's probably enough of that. So, who is AS? We've got an AS? Oh, yeah, it's there. Sorry, I was blinded by the light. Normally I throw these back, but I've learned from doing this in Melbourne that is a bad idea. Who is LB? Oh, there you go. Who is... I haven't got initials on that one, have I? I'm just going to hand it over here. Just because I'm not going to ask you to do anything too complicated with these. So, and then I've got FS. Over here. So now what I would like you to do is, I would like you to just unfold those, just hold them up nice and clear. Yeah, just up in the air just so everyone can see where those bullet holes are. Yeah? Yeah, so we can see some there, we can see some there, yeah. So now what I would ask the public audience is, where would you like to put the armour on the plane?
Everywhere where you don't see holes.
You're thinking like Abraham Wald, and I like it. What do you think most of the general public say?
Where the holes appear.
Yeah, they look at these and they go, well, there's loads of holes in the wings in green, so let's put the armour on the planes. And of course, that's where that QI siren would be going off, like, because that is what the military thought as well. But it's exactly as you say. Abraham Wald said, don't do that. You should place the armour on the engine in blue and the fuel tank in red. Because he figured that the enemy government probably were not accurate enough to be specifically targeting different parts of the plane. He thought that taking a bullet in each part of the plane, the chances should be roughly equal. And if that's true, then where are the missing bullet holes that we should be seeing in the engine and the fuel storage? And what Abraham Wald realised was that the ones that were hitting the engine were the ones that did not come back. And if your initials were DF, you probably thought, oh, this guy's a rubbish speaker, I didn't even give me my plane back. But no, we can't observe these because we're making the wrong assumption about that underlying distribution. So sometimes what you don't see tells you more than what you do see. And this is this classic example of survivorship bias. Now, when we think about survivorship bias, it's kind of obvious when we think about it, but really it comes up in everyday life. It's not just a matter of life and death. If we think about high-profile reality TV competitions, for example, so you end up with one very visible, very successful winner who might have escaped everyday life to become a star, but then we forget about the thousands of equally talented people who didn't even get profiled. Or it's especially pronounced in this kind of social media landscape. It's very well documented the serious effects it can have, particularly on young people, when we're exposed to material that's perhaps unrealistic in terms of beauty standards or lifestyle standards. And between those two kind of possible explanations, either everybody else does have perfect lives, or there is some survivorship bias and only the good times are shared and the bad ones are locked away and they get deleted. It's really obvious what's going on when we stop and think about it. But it's very easy to let our perceptions of life get distorted because, like the US military, we make the wrong assumptions about that underlying distribution. I mean, having said that, where is my flicker? Hold on one sec. Okay, that works. Having said that, I can't really understand why Ben's tweet here didn't go viral, because every time I've seen that playing on Twitter, it has a lot of retweets. So surely that one should have done well. Thank you. Nobody ever gets that one. Anyway, I think we should move on. So now we're going to visit death. Specifically, we're going to look at the context of murder trials. And because death is such a serious and somber topic, I think we should kind of look at something maybe a bit more fun in another demo that I use. And we're going to now leave our room and take part in the hottest new series on Netflix. Some of you have seen it, I can tell from that reaction. So in this episode of CSI Sydney, we're going to look at two cases. And I'm going to need your help to adjudicate them, because I'm going to ask you to be the jury. And the cases are quite different, because in the first, nobody saw the murderer, but we do have forensic evidence from the scene. And in the second, we haven't got any forensic evidence, but luckily for us, the murderer was pictured on CCTV. So let's look at the report for case one then. So DNA was obtained from the scene and compared to data records of everyone in the Greater Sydney area, which is approaching 6 million people. And our investigator has shown us what the DNA of a few people look like compared to the murderer. Now, you don't really need to know anything about DNA or even biology here. You know, don't kind of overthink it, but I'm going to let you kind of look at that for a minute. And then I'm going to ask, who is the murderer and on what evidence? Anyone want to offer a suggestion? As I say, don't overthink it.
John Doe.
John Doe, yeah, okay. Why is it John Doe?
Because you've got green, black, and red. Actually, that's the same.
Yeah, because the DNA matches exactly to the criminal's DNA.
Sorry, the evidence has been contaminated by Guinness. We can't see.
Oh, really? Right, okay.
Down the hatch.
There we go. I don't think that argument would stand up in a real courtroom, so don't try it. So yeah, we said it's John Doe, and that's fine. And the prosecutor then looks at this and says, okay, well, if only 1 in 2 people has this DNA marker, and if only 1 in 10 has this, and if only 1 in 50 has this, and only 1 in 100 has this one, the chance that any random person is going to share all these traits is very, very small. It's 1 over 2 times 10 times 50 times 100. And that works out at 0.01%. So the probability that John Doe is guilty then is 99.99%. And you agreed, so John Doe is sentenced, case closed, nice and easy. Now if we move on to case 2, this time we've got a detailed description from CCTV images. The investor has done some visual profiling. And again, I'm going to give you a moment to look at this. So we know that the murderer was aged 30 to 40. They had wavy dark hair, pointed nose, mole on left cheek, wrinkled mouth, walk with a limp. And I'm going to ask you, who is the murderer and on what evidence?
It's going to take them all out, just in case.
Again, I don't think that argument would stand in a real court. Do we have any suggestions? It seems to have stumped the jury with the proposition that all of them did it. Well, in this case, 60 people match that description, right? So we've no idea which one it was. So with case 2, it was very, very difficult to pick out the murderer. Or was it? Was it more difficult, this case? Because what if I told you there actually is no difference between these two cases? But how can that be? Well, in case 2, we have 60 people that match that description. But in case 1, our prosecutor said the chance of a random match was a tiny 0.001%. And the prosecutor was not wrong about that. But what the prosecutor missed is that 1 in 100,000, well, our DNA was matched to a database of about 6 million people in Great Britain. So we would expect 60 matches just by chance. Now, John Doe is just one of the people. And obviously, if we've got other evidence against John Doe, that evidence is going to stack up. But if we were convicting him on his DNA alone, then we've just made a really common statistical mistake that is rather appropriately known as the prosecutor's fallacy. And some of you might know this, but the fallacy here is that the prosecutor confused the probability of getting a DNA match just by chance with the probability that somebody whose DNA does match is innocent. And we now know the probability that John Doe is innocent is actually going to be 59 out of 100, because one of those 60 people did it, and it could still be him, but now we've got many, many more people to look at. And to decision makers, these kind of extreme probabilities can sound really, really convincing until they're translated into real people. And sadly, this does happen in real life. And one of the most well-known cases is that of a woman. Oh,
they've also assumed that the DNA markers are statistically independent.
well, that's true. Yeah, that's another aspect to this. And in a way, this comes up in this case as well, actually. So this is Sally Clark, and she was a woman that lived in Cheshire in England. She was an innocent woman. And in the late 1990s, she very tragically had 2 of her children die of unexplained causes while in her care, both before they reached 8 weeks old. Now, these were not twins, these were separate births, they were about a year apart. And sudden unexplained death in infants is very, very rare. And the prosecution on Sally Clark's case argued that the probability of seeing 2 unexplained sudden infant deaths in the same family was so vanishingly small that the only explanation could be that Sally Clark must have murdered her children. And so she was wrongly convicted, and the prosecutor's argument was later taken apart by statisticians for a whole bunch of reasons. For example, the wrong probabilities we used to start with, and again, they didn't consider hereditary genetic factors that might make 2 incidents more likely, and so on. But even working with the given probability argument, if we consider the large number of families that do live back home in the UK, we would sadly expect to see 1 double sudden unexplained infant death every couple of decades or so. And one statistician who gave commentary name was Professor Ray Hill. And he pointed out, although double sudden unexplained infant death is extremely rare, you know what's even rarer? Double infant murder. So from a statistical perspective, well, you'd expect that, the statistical expectation, I guess, would support innocence from the start, because a double infant murder is a much rarer event than a double sudden unexplained infant death. And because of that, I suppose, serious misuse of statistics, as one of this article puts it, Sally actually served over 3 years in prison before she was released. Her life was never the same afterwards because of that miscarriage of justice. She developed severe PTSD, psychiatric problems, alcohol dependency, and that very tragically led to her eventual death about 4 years after she was released. And so the key here, yes?
I think that matches the Folding case in Australia.
I've heard about this case, yeah. I wasn't aware of this until I did this talk in Melbourne, yeah.
She had 3 children, 4 died of apparent cot death, and the scientists came out and said it could be genetic.
Mm-hmm. And was she convicted?
Yes.
She was,
Right.
and then let out.
Right, okay.
Decades later.
Yeah. So these kind of events have huge implications for people's lives. You know, it can absolutely destroy Sally's life, and I've no doubt it destroyed her life as well. So the key really, I guess, is that even very rare events can be found if you look hard enough. I mean, in Australia, there's a population of about, 26, 27 million?
27.
So 1 in a million chances then are going to come true for, on average, 27 people here, whether that's for better or for worse. Now, I guess I'm going to move on to pestilence, or in other words, stats around health and disease. And when you think of the horsemen of the apocalypse, you could probably have a good guess at which newspapers they choose to read. So I've got some of Pestilence's favourites here, because we sometimes see attention-grabbing headlines about health, like in October 2015, we heard processed meats pose same cancer risk as asbestos. Just 2 rashers of bacon a day raises your risk of cancer. And drop the bacon roll, processed meat is as bad for you as smoking, in capital letters, so you know it's serious. Well, where did all this come from? So this stemmed from about a 500 or so page report by the International Agency for Cancer, and they reviewed a large amount of evidence to try and find a scientific consensus, which is very, very standard practice. This was then summarised in a journal article in The Lancet, and the primary finding, as written there, is that people who ate an additional 50 grams of processed meat every day, which is probably about as much bacon you'd find on a typical sandwich, they had an increased risk of bowel cancer by 18%. And it's that 18% that was reported on in the media. So these are quotes from the news articles. A lot of people found this really scary because they read this as 1 in 5 people, or an additional 1 in 5 people, is now going to develop cancer because we eat processed meat. And what none of these articles really reported on was what these numbers actually meant. And so I always think the question that we need to ask is, if we hear that our risk has changed, if it's gone up, what was our risk to start with? And the absolute risk of developing bowel cancer in everybody's lifetime is about 6 in 100. There's not really anything we can do about that. You know, we take this risk just by being living humans. And what happens then if this risk increases by 18%? Well, it frightened many people because without additional information, many people heard this as absolute risk rather than relative risk. And what I mean by that is they heard this as taking those 6 in 100 people that would develop bowel cancer in their lifetime, adding on 18 in 100 people to make 24 in 100. But the increase that report calculated was relative. So it was adding on 18% relative to that 6%. And 18% of 6 works out at about just 1 single extra case. Really, it's not even that exciting, because remember, to see that extra case, every one of these 100 people has to be eating that 50 grams processed meat every day to see it. But on average, we don't eat anywhere near that much processed meat every day. I think the average for the UK is given us something like 17 grams, which is about a bacon sandwich every 3 days or a sausage every other day. And I suppose we've got to accept that if we start every morning with a bacon sandwich, can't rightly call it healthy eating. But is this... Oh no, the most controversial statement I've ever made. But is this one case in 100 really enough for us to change our eating habits off the back of this study? I would say probably not, for me, because the risk is not as much as the reporting implied. Well, all right, if that's true, how come processed meat got compared to smoking and asbestos? Where did that come from? Well, this is about how the IARC classifies what we know. So processed meat is found in group 1 up there with smoking and asbestos. But this system is designed to measure quality and strength of evidence, not strength of effect. So in other words, this system is the answer to the question, how confident are we that a link exists between these things and cancer? And not the question, how much these things increase the risk of cancer. So even though we are sure there is a link between processed meat and cancer, it's not actually as dangerous as smoking. You know, we're not all going to sit down our children in the future and warn them a bit about the dangers of doing processed and joining those teenage gangs that you see chipolatas hanging out with mouths around the bus stop. Probably the best reframing of this comes from the cartoonist Saturday Morning Breakfast serial. So, tragically, as a newscaster, I'm unable to understand the difference between the questions, does an effect exist, and how strong is the effect? And therefore, I've just categorised all things into causes cancer and does not cause cancer. For example, the fact that I am wearing a toupee, or sorry, the fact that I'm bald, means that the people around me get a slightly higher dose of radiation from my body than they would if I'd worn a toupee. I, Steve Jennings, newscaster, cause cancer. Did statisticians get loose in the newsroom again? Stay back, cancer head. You know, this confusion of absolute and relative risk, it happens all the time if you only report percentages. I mean, here's a similar study. So in 2012, we heard that coffee might reduce the risk of heart failure, with 1 to 2 cups of coffee a day cutting your risk by about 11%. That was an average figure across a bunch of different studies. So here's a pretty representative one. In this one, they found a 9% reduction, going down from 1 to 0.91 there. But the problem is, based on these sample sizes and cases, the baseline risk of heart failure across everyone is actually, it's also 6 in 100. And if everyone has 2 coffees a day, that is going to reduce to 5 in 100, groundbreaking. So next article that came out, actually, yeah, just forget about it. And actually, if you have more coffee, it seems to reduce again. But then if you keep having more and more coffee, it curves back around and increases your risk. And really, this here is the key point from this study for me. Yeah, is that people are drinking more than 10 cups of coffee a day. A third of people, more than 10 cups. I don't even have 10 drinks a day. And presumably that little 2% increased risk of heart failure is from the strain of these people never being off the toilet. So the more rare the event is, the more extreme these probabilities are going to seem. So if your risk of brain cancer apparently triples if you have 2 CT scans in childhood. But actually, we go from only 1 case of cancer in 20,000 to 3 in 20,000. And again, all of those 20,000 have to be having multiple CT scans in childhood, which is a very rare thing. Yes?
Is this correlative or causative? If you've got brain cancer, you're more likely to have CT scans.
Yes.
I think in this case, they did look at it temporarily. I think the original study did you had to have the CT scans before you were diagnosed with brain cancer. I mean, that's not to say that you wouldn't have other symptoms that show this, but I mean, still, it's very, very small. And absolutely, there will be other underlying health conditions that factor into this. This is sort of one of the problems of these kind of studies. Perhaps another one. A way of reframing the risk that I quite like comes from Sir David Spiegelhalter. And he looked into this article, Why Binge Watching Your TV Box Sets Could Kill You. And this reported on a study that looked into time spent watching TV every night to fatal blood clots in the lungs. So if you have, if you're watching more than 5 hours of TV, you're more than twice as likely to die. And David Spiegelhalter said, well, if that's correct, how much exposure do we have to have before we see a given difference? Before we see one additional death in blood clot, how much TV do we have to watch cumulatively in our lifetime? Any guesses? Any guesses for how much TV one has to watch in their lifetime to see this extra blood clot case? 10,000 hours? Well, 10,000 hours is a good guess, but it actually works out at 2,500 years in your lifetime.
That's like half of one piece.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I know it seems that long when you try and sit down and make it through Love Island, but no one's getting anywhere near this much exposure as 2,500 years. Okay, most of them are really quite old articles now, but the bacon and cancer thing is a very, very well cited example. Have things improved? Well, let's have a look at a recent example. So this is an email I got from the Science Media Centre about, when did I get it? A couple of months back. And the Science Media Centre is another organisation that tries to connect up journalists to scientific experts to try and break down, communicate studies. And in this case, we've got a study or a piece of evidence around processed meat and dementia risk. And press release is going out, and it's obviously going to be of interest to the media. So, fortunately, or unfortunately, I should say, I got this request while I was on holiday. So, I do regret not being able to contribute and make a comment on it. But never mind, I'm sure the report is all going to be fine. That's all right. Let's preempt the next bit. What? No. No! Not only are we making the same mistake again, we've now made it worse by slapping a bit of nationalism on it. Like now we can't eat our favourite British foods. Yeah, so even though there is generally more data literacy out there now, this kind of headline reporting of relative risk still happens, and you can bet none of these articles gave the baseline or absolute risk. So let's see if we can find what it is. So this is the press release. The key takeaway is that 2 servings of processed meat every week raises risk of dementia by 14%. Okay, nothing in the press release about baseline risk. Let's check the original research. Oh, this is it. This actually isn't even published research or even a preprint paper. This is a description of a talk that is going to be presented at a conference. This little box is all that we're basing these national headlines on. Yeah. And guess what? No baseline risk. So I've had a guess at what the baseline risk is in this study, based on the fact they say they found about 6,800 cases in 87,000 people. So I'm guessing that baseline dementia risk is about 8 in 100, so a 14% risk will move up to 9 in 100. But I mean, that's already an overestimate because I can't tell from this little box how many people did or did not eat red meat in the study. Now, what does give me hope, though, is that the Science Media Centre comments were pretty excellent. So many of them pointed out, the full details are not there. This is not the full study. And we don't know if they adjusted for lifestyle factors, that sort of thing. But what gives me even more hope is that these Science Media Centre comments were used across, honestly, most of the journalist reporting, even in some kind of press outlets that I would never have expected to take on Science Media Centre comments. So of course all these quoted risk percentages, they're not strictly wrong. They are a useful piece of information, and they are useful, these studies, to figure out things about population health trends over time, but they just don't tell the full story by themselves. And I guess it's not surprising that people react to this stuff really strongly. I mean, firstly, when people see these messages, they think they're quite alarmist. But the other problem with them is that when somebody like me or a statistician or a public health expert comes in and clarifies, actually, the change in risk is not as big as it seems, a lot of members of the public see that as backtracking. And they see that as it's just scientists changing their mind. They can't decide what the truth is. And that creates some sort of issues of trust. And I'm going to come back to this because next I'm probably talking about what is the scariest item of them all. The public Other humans should have done this one. No, I guess I just want to finish by talking about public perceptions about stats and maybe some ways forward. I mean, all of us are susceptible to these fallacies that I presented, including decision makers like judges, including communicators like journalists. And it's pretty well quoted. The amount of data that exists in the world is increasing. Commonly quoted estimate, 90% of the world's data was generated in the last 2 years alone, which is crazy, right? Because we've got a hugely exponential increase. So the problem's not going to go away. We're going to keep being confronted by more and more numbers in our everyday life. So what can we do to improve things? And the way that I think about that is by asking the bigger question, well, what is even science to begin with? And from what I see, the public tends to think of science as a tool that tells you what's true and what's false. And this, I guess, dichotomized perspective of science as just right or wrong, I don't really know where it comes from. Maybe it's down to speed of modern life. We just maybe want one single, simple, digestible answer, if you'll excuse the pun, because it means we end up with articles like this. Is pasta healthy or unhealthy? To which the real correct answer is yes. I mean, yes, it's healthy or it's unhealthy, depending on the nuances of your exact diet, your genetics, many, many other factors. But I guess that's not an enticing answer. So instead, I would define science as a tool that tells you the uncertainty around what's true and what's false by evidence guesses. And of course, if we don't communicate uncertainty properly, that can lead to problems. So thinking about flu for a second, flu outbreaks are generally quite difficult to predict. I mean, Spanish flu, when it arrived in the spring of 1918, it really didn't seem that different to any other seasonal flu. Then by autumn, something had changed. And it became the worst pandemic in modern history. It killed close to about 5% of the world's population. So when we had the most recent influenza pandemic, which was swine flu back in 2009, it's sensible to prepare for the worst. And this 65,000 deaths figure was quoted a lot back home in the UK. But this was actually just one of many potential scenarios calculated. But everyone was quite fixated around this 65,000 deaths headline. And it actually turned out to be relatively mild. We had something like 400 swine flu deaths in the UK during that pandemic. And I think many people lost faith in science even all the way back then because it looked like scientists had got it wrong. But it wasn't really a failure to predict so much as it was a failure to communicate that uncertainty. And the responsibility for that does lie with people like me, with the academics, with the scientists. And our role is not just to make these predictions, but to effectively and accurately communicate them. And of course, there was a lot more heated debate, I tend to use the word toxic discourse around very similar issues around the COVID-19 modelling. An astrophysicist, Saul Permutter here, he actually goes a layer deeper on the question and says, well, science is not even a finished tool. The way that we conduct research needs improvements. It needs better control of unconscious biases, open data, changes to how we publish research. I mean, it's pretty well known, this concept of a reproducibility crisis. So some estimated proportion of research findings cannot be independently replicated. And for some fields, that's as high as 90%. So is everything that we think we know just a complete fluke? Were those findings not real? I guess that's a bigger question, but to address public understanding of stats, I mean, clearly we need better training. First of all, training the actual researchers who should be doing this communication. And I find it shocking that communicating statistics is still part of very few degree programs, even though most scientific fields have gotten more and more quantitative over the last 10, 20 years. And secondly, maybe I don't know, just some basic critical thinking needs to be part of an earlier curriculum. I mean, we have this bloody well-worn argument all the time about, I learned all this abstract maths in school and I never used it. What was the point? All right, fair enough. Maybe we should be teaching more data literacy then, or more kind of quantitative critical thinking. I mean, shouldn't that be taught in place of some of this abstract maths? People don't like doing that. I think the world's reliance on data has grown so quick, like that exponential curve. taken a lot for the teaching to catch up. And I think most people haven't realised that stats is not just something for mathematicians. And of course, changes to teaching don't reach the majority of people who are no longer in education, so anything else we can do? Well, schemes like the Royal Statistical Society's media ambassadors, and also University of Cambridge has a professorship of stats in public life, so that's currently held by John Aston. So having these sort of dedicated communication experts, I suppose, really does help, but there's so much more to be done. And really, that is exactly why I do all this stupid stuff like pissing around with paper planes and sticking boxes on people's heads. And if you can think of a better way of getting folks to understand stats than this, then please help me with ideas. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you so much for having me.